Good afternoon. My name is Ala McCoy. I'm Director of Faculty Startup Support. I'm very pleased to welcome Edmund Pendleton to join us today, who joined us today to teach a workshop on business models. Very interesting topic and a very important one. So Edmund is a successful cashed out entrepreneur, a very experienced startup mentor, and a very experienced I-Core instructor. And he has been teaching the I-Core methodology for quite many years and is just really excellent at it. So thank you so much for agreeing to join us. And why don't you go ahead and take the center stage. But before we begin, I forgot to mention, so if you have any questions during the session, please submit them via the Q&A function at the bottom. You can submit them anonymously if you prefer, or you can also raise your hand and I can unmute your microphone and you can ask your question via the microphone live. So either way you prefer. All right, Edmund, go ahead and take it away. I will stop my video, but I am right here.
All right, well, thank you, Ala. Let me get my slides going, everyone, and very excited to be here with you this afternoon. And Ala, let me know if there seems to be any issue, but I'll start.
Yeah, all good.
With a quick intro, and Ala's already done this for me, but I'll just repeat what she said. I always introduce myself as a technology entrepreneur because I think once you've been one, that's the way you always think of yourself. And so one of the reasons I'm so passionate about what I teach at Maryland and for NSF and the I-Core program is because I went through all of it, right? The hard knocks and everything. I was lucky to get through it. We ultimately had a successful exit, but it took a long time to get there. But I've also been involved, as Ala mentioned, really teaching I-Core now for, it's almost 10 years, not exactly 10 years that I've had exposure, but almost 10 years. I've done a lot of consulting as well for corporate clients that are looking to do new types of product development and find new opportunities for innovation. A lot of what I teach in I-Core is relevant, although I have modified what I do for them to better suit their needs. And I've been doing it a very long time. As Ala mentioned, I always reference the 10,000 plus hours. If anybody has any familiarity with Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, he says you have to have 10,000 hours to be an expert. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I do have a lot of experience in the area, and I can obviously share that with you. And at this point, I've worked with well over 3,000 teams, about half of those in a very sort of tight, coordinated way, and another half just in online courses and things where it's been more light touch. But I've had a lot of exposure to different types of teams and things. So what we're going to do today is talk about one of the key tools that we use in I-Core, but more importantly, regardless of I-Core, it's a key tool that you can use to think through whether or not you might have an opportunity to build a business. So it's a fairly simple, in some ways, framework to think about what's really required to build a business. But the hard work of validating whether you're headed in the right direction takes a lot more time. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time today talking about it, but I will be referencing on occasion the fact that, well, it's all fine and good to sort of fill in the blanks here of what you think you should be doing with your business model. But the real sort of trick is going out and validating that. And we typically do that through a process of customer discovery, which is probably another topic you may have heard about or you will hear about. But today we're going to focus very much on business models, what's actually involved, and sort of set a foundation for you. So I talk about business models, I summarize by saying it's really the best way to simplify and summarize what the value of a business is. And that's essentially what a business model does. And maybe put slightly differently, a business model is how a company creates, delivers, and captures value. Now, it could be a not-for-profit, it could be an organization. A business model is really just meant to be a way for you to understand how to create, deliver, and capture value. Whether or not you make a profit depends on, of course, your ultimate end goal. Most of the companies, or I should say most of the teams I work with, want to become for-profit businesses, of course, but the same sort of tool really applies well to even the not-for-profit types of ventures that we sometimes run into. Now, the one book and framework we tend to reference the most is one by Alex Osterwalder. He wrote a book called Business Model Generation. It's a great book. It's actually relatively comprehensive and thick, but we use one particular page out of it called the Business Model Canvas. And this canvas has become extremely popular. In fact, most people, when you talk to them about lean innovation or lean startup or anything that's going on today in the field of entrepreneurship, they will talk about the canvas. Again, it's a great tool. I'll explain to you what its limitations are, but it's a great communication tool for you to share what you're thinking, and also a great checklist for you to use as you're trying to validate whether you're doing the right things when it comes to building a new business. Now I'm going to take a slight detour and come back. So I happen to love this book written by a surgeon from the Boston area who has done a lot of things. He's a writer for the New Yorker. He is very well known. In fact, he served on the current administration's transition team. But he wrote a really fascinating book a few years called The Checklist Manifesto. And the reason I love the book is sort of twofold, really two reasons. So number one, the sort of discovery that he used in the process of creating a new way of doing surgeries. He noted that when he boarded airplanes all the time, flying to conferences and to visit people, that the pilots always had a checklist in front of them, and they went through the checklist and they made sure that they did all the critical things they needed to do before they took off. And of course, that's a good thing. If you're flying on a plane, that makes you feel good. But what he said was, I recognized right away, we don't do that in the operating room, and I had no idea why. So he actually created a checklist procedure for various types of surgeries and made it available, and the World Health Organization adopted it. And they called this checklist one of the most important innovations of the last couple of decades. So I like that story because number one, it shows that you can have a really, impactful sort of innovation and not have any technology at all involved. Now, most of the teams I work with are technology-based teams, and that was certainly what my startup was, a technology-based startup. But understand that actually innovation is broader than that, right? Innovation is finding an opportunity to help someone. It's not enough to have something new, whether that's a new technology or a new process or something else. You need to find an actual need in the market for that, quote, invention or thing. So I love the story from that perspective, but I also love it because I think of the canvas very much as a business checklist. All the things I need to figure out and understand before I can actually build a business. Now, when we teach the course of I-Core, and when I teach at the University of Maryland, what I'm often doing is I'm taking teams and helping them determine how to fill out that canvas and validate that they're headed in the right direction. So not just writing into the little boxes, but actually proving that what they're putting into those boxes is in fact true. And so that's a process we call customer discovery, and sometimes I just call it discovery. And so I also use the map as what I might call a sort of a discovery map, so to speak. I should say I use the canvas as a discovery map. The various things that we will guide a team through in terms of really trying to understand whether or not they're headed in the right direction as they build out a business. Okay. Now, just a quick reminder, as Ala mentioned, feel free to put in questions to her that she will see, or if you want to come off of mute and just ask a question, feel free to do that at any time. This is meant to be conversational and informal. But when looking at the canvas, one of the things I highlight to people is the right side of it. So it does have some logic the way it's laid out. The right-hand side is very customer focused, and we're going to talk about each of these elements in a minute, but they're all highly dependent on the customer you go after. And then the left-hand side is more of the details, right? How am I going to build my company, right? how am I actually going to structure it to go after the customer that I've identified? So again, right hand side, very focused on the customer. Everything is very much dependent on the customer. Left hand side is more about the business and how you plan to build it out. And we're going to talk about each of these elements in some degree of detail as we go through this afternoon. Now, I mentioned this, but again, at the sort of very high level, the macro level, 30,000-foot level, the business model measures value to the business. In other words, how do we actually create value? And if you'll notice, the bottom box on the right is revenue, the one on the left is cost. And clearly what we're hoping, right, is that we can push that revenue higher, push the cost down, and build a profitable business. But in essence, we're looking at this balance. And for a profit business, we want that to go up. You know, for even a not-for-profit business, we want to make sure these things at least balance one another. So again, the business model and sort of at the highest level, it actually helps you measure the value to the business, right? Are we actually creating something of value? Now, when most people see the canvas, one of the things that I have them go through, and I won't make you do it here, but if you were coming into I-Corps, I would kind of walk you through a process of thinking about, well, where would we actually start? If I just gave you a blank sheet of paper, right, with the 9 boxes, which one would you fill in first? And you can think about this in your head for a minute. Now, most people, this is what they do, because again, I get mostly technology-based teams. So most of the time, what they're really doing is this. They fill in what they have, key resources. We have this intellectual property, or we've worked on this thing, we've got this invention. That's really a key resource for you. The goal of the business is to turn that resource into a different type of asset, money, and hopefully a lot of money, right? But in the beginning, you start with kind of what you have. Now, some people also add what they do. So your key activities. So sometimes your incoming value that you think you're going to, or I should say the things you think you will derive value from, come from stuff you have and things you can do. Right? We have certain skills we can monetize, or we have certain stuff like IP or inventions we can monetize. And based on that, what most people do is they step back and say, well, we think we could really help those people over there. So here we have this hypothetical value for these customers we think might be potential for us. It's rare that teams I deal with come in with any more than that, just a guess at who they might be able to help. And it could be that you've been one of those people. In fact, my startup, I won't tell you too much about that right now. We'll save it for another time. But in my startup, we were selling to people that I was, or at least I thought I was. We were recreating sort of the way that people did construction surveying. I was a 3rd-generation civil engineer. My first summer job had been as a surveyor. So I thought I knew everything there was to know about surveying. Of course, it turned out to be that I did not know that much about surveying, and I quickly found out. Or another way to put it is I did not know how to sell to people that were surveyors. That's for sure. I may have known a little bit about surveying, but I didn't know how to sell to them. So again, this is the way most people start with the canvas. But here's a really important thing, especially for inventors or technologists like us, most of us on this call. It's hard to admit it, but just because you can do it does not necessarily mean people will value it. And we have a lot of people that come into our course that'll say, well, we're the first ones ever that have done this. No one's done anything like what we're doing. This is brand new. And on the face of it, that sounds exciting. I mean, everybody gets excited. Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. Maybe they've gotten a patent or they're going to get a patent. It's brand new. It's novel. The real question is, though, is there anybody out there that's going to value it, be willing to pay for it, right? Because again, when you're building a business, that's the goal. We're not just doing things for knowledge's sake or just to contribute to science. We're actually doing it because we're trying to build a business. So the question is, who out there values it other than the people that funded me or other than myself? So given that, most people then step back and say, okay, well, based on what we have, what we think we can do, here's some customers that we think might need our stuff. So on the canvas, what we say is you need to think about a customer segment. Now, in some other sources, you might hear people say market segment, which I actually like a little bit better. But in this case, we'll just call them customer segments. And here's what I want you to think about. The customer segment is a logical group of people that has a common or nearly the same set of needs that your solution can address. So it's this idea that, oh, if I can just draw the boundary around this group of people, those are the people that'll be my customers potentially. Now, there's always a little fuzziness in that line, right? It's not always so clear and obvious how to draw that boundary. But that's kind of the goal, to make sure that we know who belongs in a segment, the sort of target for the types of people that we know have a common set of needs that our solution can address. All right. So that's the theory behind it. Figuring out who belongs in that segment is a little bit of the trick, though. Now, many people, sorry for all the words here, I'll just kind of narrate it. Most people that come in trying to figure out whether they have anything start talking to multiple segments, right? Well, maybe it's in my company, it was, well, maybe it's construction, but maybe it's also special effects and also accident crime scene reduction and even aerospace. In the very beginning, we had 4 or 5 markets that we thought could be good customers. One of our biggest mistakes that nearly killed us off was we tried to serve all of them at once. Anybody that would call and say, we might need your thing, we would jump on a plane and go visit them, right? We didn't step back and try to understand where the best place in the market was for us to start. So again, during this exploration, it's okay to look at several, but when you actually start selling, you want to be very, very focused. So one of the main goals of going through this process and understanding not only what's in a business model, but how you validate one of the main target or objectives is understanding where that beachhead is. Where should we start, right? And that's what we call a beachhead segment, right? Where should we start in the market? And then we can expand from there. Now, for those who are interested, there are lots of lists online for why startups typically fail. And I happen to like this one, and I zoom in and I show the top 3 reasons. So number 1, building something nobody wants, which is just another way of saying not enough people want it. It's not that no one wants it usually, it's that not enough people want it to build a business around it. You might find a couple of customers, but the question is, are there enough out there that you can build a business around? So that's number 1. Number 2, hiring poorly, just not having the right team. You can imagine that would be pretty common. And then number 3, lack of focus. Now I've circled this because I actually think lack of focus drives a lot of number 1. People like me try to sell to too many people at the same time, or they try to sell to all construction surveyors, which is what I also tried to do, without realizing that they aren't the same either. There were 3 or 4 subgroups of surveyors, and only one of them made sense for us to go after. But I didn't know this. I didn't do any kind of discovery in advance. I just tried to sell to all of them, and not just all of them, but also to all these other markets. So you can see I was very defocused, right? Very defocused in the beginning. So if you're thinking about the types of things that sort of trip people up, these are the ones that I always highlight. And another way to think about it is, if I'm going after different customers, construction, aerospace, special effects, they probably require a different business model. Now, I've kind of highlighted here to show that these are different business models, and maybe there would be some overlap between them. But the biggest mistake a lot of startups try to make is this one. I'm just going to sell to anybody and everybody, and only to find out, well, they have a different set of needs. They have a different way you need to reach them, and they have different expectations in terms of what they're willing to pay for something. And so you'll be going crazy as a startup trying to do that. So it's always better to have one that you target in the beginning when you go to market. So there are a number of ways to limit this list. I'm going to show a few before we dive into the canvas, and I'll do this relatively quickly, but I want to highlight something that I always stress. Most people, when they're thinking about a startup, they're actually thinking about this, not the startup. They're thinking, gosh, I can't wait till I sell my company for a lot of money and I can move to the beach, right? Or some variant of this. This is certainly what I had hoped for and wanted as well. But I always say, before you find this beach, you need to find a beachhead market, meaning you need to find a place where you can grab a hold and build a business and grow from there. So it's really critical, and it's something we preach to all of our teams, to understand that beachhead market. There are a number of things to think about, but I'll hit one that should be somewhat obvious, but then we're going to spend a lot of time the rest of today kind of talking about why it's not always so obvious. But does the customer have a compelling reason or need to buy? All right. That's the first question we need to ask ourselves, because if not, it's probably not a good beachhead. And on the canvas, if we were using this tool, this is kind of where that lives. So if you were to come into my class, or I were helping you work out a business model, this is where the question or the answer to this question resides. It's in these two boxes. Who's the customer? What's the value I'm bringing to them? That's really sort of the compelling reason to buy. All right. How accessible is the customer? You know, sometimes we have teams that come in and they want to serve markets in other countries, and there's nothing wrong with this, of course, but it's hard for them to reach those types of customers often. So understanding that's important, and that comes up in a couple of the boxes on the canvas, which we'll talk more about in a minute. Is the target customer well-funded and able to pay? Again, you got to remind yourself, this is hard again for academics, technologists like us, but if we're building a business, we have to charge people, we have to make money. Are they able to pay, right? Not just can we help them, but are they actually able to pay? Or do they have very long sales cycles or very limited budgets? And you'd be surprised at how often this actually comes up as well. It seems somewhat obvious, but again, it isn't always obvious, certainly to a startup. Will you have a full solution, or perhaps you're going to need partners? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes too. But this is just another way of saying, do you envision that you will need another company to work with you in order to go after the customer you plan to go after? If so, that's a little bit more risky than if you have the full solution yourself. But these are all considerations when you're stepping back and asking yourself, okay, what type of business model am I building? And then there are other somewhat obvious questions. I know this is a little bit more detail than you probably need today, but some things to think about. You know, are there already competitors in the market? Are there related or adjacent segments? In other words, other opportunities I could easily go after? And then does this line up with my passion, interests, and goals, right? Because if you're building a startup on your own, it's already hard enough work. So it better align with your passion and interests. Could be that sometimes you find a market opportunity you don't really care that much about. I didn't really care that much about accent scene reconstruction, as an example. I cared a lot about construction because that's where my family background sort of came from. I cared a lot about aerospace because I found it interesting. So again, you have to make sure that these things line up as well. So a couple of quick takeaways, and then we'll jump into a little more detail here. So the business model is really, it helps you identify how to create, deliver, and capture value. So that's takeaway number one. Takeaway number two, different customer segments require different business models. So if you're a startup, when you go to market, you don't want to try to be serving too many different customers, or you will find it won't work. And then number three, the search for the beachhead, right? Really, where should you start in the market begins with understanding if the customer has a compelling reason or need to buy. All right. All somewhat obvious when you state it, but figuring this out can take time if you're using the discovery process and you're talking to customers and other stakeholders to figure it out. Okay. So that's the super high level. I'm now going to dive into a little more detail and talk a little bit more about some specifics as it relates to each of the boxes. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat to Ala and she can ask, or again, come off mute and feel free to ask. So that's the high level. We've talked about the canvas and the 9 boxes are involved. Let's dig into each of them and talk a little bit more in detail. And I'm going to spend more time on customers and value propositions than I will the others, and hopefully that'll be obvious why once I'm done. But let's talk about customers for a minute, because this is a very logical term we all use, but if you ask 10 people to define a customer, they're likely to tell you different types of things, right? So one of the things I like to highlight is that many people that I work with are not selling to just general consumers. They might be, but most of the time they're not. Usually they're selling to another company. This other company might be using their product or embedding their product into one of their products and selling it to somebody else. So one of the first things you have to figure out when you're trying to figure out how to segment the market is, well, who's involved in a purchase decision? So I just did this class. I'm in the middle of the class for the National Institutes of Health. A lot of the teams in that particular class are focused on helping people that work at hospitals, as an example. And you can see that when you sell to a hospital, it's not enough to say, well, I'm going to sell to hospitals. You have to figure out, well, who's inside the hospital that I need to understand? Who are the users, people that'll put their hands on my product or service? Who are the decision makers that make a financial purchase decision? Are they the same or different? And often you will find that they are different. And then ask yourself, are there other types of influencers? Are there other people inside the hospital I better understand? Maybe it's support staff, people that maintain or watch after equipment if you're selling equipment, for example. So when you're thinking about customers, you have to think, okay, people, what roles do people play? Where do I find them? So if I'm selling to another business, I really have to understand this in a very detailed way. If I'm selling to consumers, they tend to play all these roles collectively: user, decision maker. They're just individuals that are buying or adopting your solution. But when we're selling to another business, there are always people that are involved. And sometimes there's some that are outside of that buying organization, like a beneficiary, like a patient. The patient doesn't get value from the new medical device that I might develop, then there's no reason the surgeon in the hospital will want to use it, or the hospital to buy it to provide to the surgeon, right? So you have to show that there's value to the ultimate beneficiary too. But that beneficiary might not have any say in whether the thing is actually bought, which is somewhat ironic. So there are a lot of different influences you have to understand. And at a very simplistic level, you're trying to figure out who has the balance of influence, who matters the most in adoption. Sometimes that's the user, sometimes it's somebody else, but understanding that can be really important. So again, when we talk about customers, you have to start to ask yourselves, who are the people involved? What roles will they play? Now, generally, we have people focus on who uses and who makes a decision to buy. So end users, people that put their hands on the product or service, they're interacting with your idea, your concept. Because if you're not helping them, you won't have a sale, right? Because without an end user, there is no customer. So you have to figure out who these people are. It's also important to understand at least the decision makers, or, who makes a financial purchase decision. Is it the same people or a different group of people? And we could kind of guess they might care about different things, but it's important to understand that, because sometimes these people overrule those people. In other words, they might make a decision that says, we only have so much budget. We're not going to actually fund a new product for the surgeon because we need that money for somebody else. So again, understanding users and decision makers, really important. Now, the final sort of subtle point, I know a little bit in the detail here, but it's just to highlight that these roles that people play, user, decision maker, and others, are not the same thing as segments. Each segment has each of these roles attached. So I want you to think of it that way. If I'm selling to hospitals, they have users and decision makers, others involved. If I'm also selling to some other type, let's say a clinic, that has a similar potential use, then those clinics have a different set of users and decision makers. So again, segments different than the roles of people that you will find in each segment. So you first start with, okay, what segment and then what roles do I need to understand? All right. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we mean by customer, right? A little bit of an idea. And there's more detail we could share some other time. But here's where it gets kind of interesting, in my opinion. And we're still in the customer box, right? We're still in that customer box. And the canvas doesn't directly ask for this, but we push teams to understand it. So not just who are the people we're helping, but what jobs do they have? Now, when I say job, I don't mean job title. I mean, what are they hiring your thing to do? So when you look at why people adopt solutions, you might say, well, it's a business of this type. This is the kind of person that's a user. This is the type of company in the industry sector these people come from. And that's all helpful. But none of that tells you why the person might adopt. The only thing that tells you why the person might adopt is the job. What are they trying to accomplish that they're hiring your thing to do for them? And how are they doing it today? Right? You have to understand how they're doing it today to understand where their perceived needs are. But again, you start with, okay, well, what job? What job am I helping people do? And who has that job in the type of company I might be talking to? So think of it this way, just like you would hire employees to do a job, customers hire products and services to get jobs done. And oh, by the way, if a better employee comes along, better solution, they might hire that product, right, over yours. So understanding that customers care about getting jobs done and they're going to hire the best products and services that are available to them at the time to get that job done, right? So visually think of, I have a user, I have to understand that person's job. Now there's a really interesting quote. I like this quote to help drive home this concept. You may have heard this before, but I love it. People don't want a 1/4-inch drill. They want a 1/4-inch hole. So for any of you that are thinking that you have some kind of new thing, some new product, some new technology, I want you to separate yourself from that for a moment and ask yourself, well, what's the 1/4-inch hole? What would we be doing, right? What's the value we're going to bring? What would we be doing for the customer? And how would I describe that without talking about my technology? Because there are a lot of ways to potentially get a 1/4-inch hole. A drill is just one solution to that problem, okay? So we have people step back and ask this question. You may remember this, but if not, this is an iPod. And I always use this example. I say, if you could describe the job, how would you describe it? And I just jump straight to this because I think it's pretty good. Listen to music while on the go. So, and you can think of other jobs you could do with this, but if we stick with listen to music while on the go, the thing I want to highlight here is it's this context of the job. Where am I listening to music? On the go. Okay, well, that really determines the needs I have and makes this a much better solution. Whereas if I were just listening to music sitting at home in my living room, I might not choose that. I might choose some fancy stereo system, right? So again, customer, what's the job? And then once we pick a job, how do they decide what solution, what better means for a solution? So this is the final sort of point here as it relates to customers. We have to understand the person, the job we hope to help them with, and then what are their perceived needs today? And again, depending on the type of person you are or type of person you're talking to, if you're talking to users, they have a set of criteria. I want to make sure that I get these performance things done. You might have a financial decision maker that has some financial criteria, how much things can cost and that type of thing they care about. And then even others. But again, we typically start here, so I won't go into a lot more detail other than to say it's important to step back and say, okay, we have a new concept, we have a new technology, great. Who might be the user? What might they be trying to do with our thing? And today, if they were to pick a solution, another solution to get that thing done, what do they care about? What really drives user adoption? I use this image to remind myself to tell you that the way I want you to think of these decision criteria is I want you to think of them as the knobs and dials that a customer has, the things that matter to the customer. And these are different than the features that you have, which we'll talk about here in just a minute as it relates to value propositions. So we've talked about customers as people. They have jobs, they have needs, knobs and dials I need to address. But we haven't talked about what we have. How do we know whether or not we have something they're going to care about? And this gets us to that next box, value proposition. So why and when will customers adopt your solution? Now, honestly, for most teams I work with, if I can get them to this point, it's a huge success. We may not finish the rest of the canvas. We may not have time for that. But we're going to go through this, and then I'll cover a few of the additional topics in the canvas before we wrap up. But most people spend their time thinking about customers and perceived value propositions. Why and when will customers actually adopt? So I sometimes do this as an interactive example, but I won't do it today just for the sake of time. But I will tell you a little story. My mother, I bought her an iPhone 5C. It's been 10 years ago now, or however long it's been since the iPhone 5C was out. And she loved the color. One of the advantages of the iPhone 5C, in addition to being lower priced, was the fact that it came in multiple colors. And all Mac fans know that's a very Mac sort of thing to do. So if you looked at this, you might describe, well, one of the features of the product is the color. But what's the real value? You know, and for my mom, there were a couple. One, it made her feel cool because that was her favorite color. But also it made it easier for her to find it in her purse. It wouldn't just get lost, right? So there's a difference between the feature and what it actually does, the value it brings. And that's a really fundamental point to keep in mind, okay? Customers have criteria, things they care about as it relates to jobs they want to do. Your product, though, has features. The question is, how does it help them? How does it address those criteria that might matter to them? So I won't bore you with this example, but I'll just say you can look at things like consumer reports that rate all kinds of products. And this is a good one of an example of a grill, number of grills that they were comparing. And if you're a grill expert, maybe you can look at these specs and figure out what would best suit your needs. But if you're trying to create a new grill, you're a grill startup, you'd look at this and probably not know, well, what is it that customers care about? Which one of these things really matter? And the nice thing about Consumer Reports, which is a consumer magazine, is they do that translation for you. So here's the what does the thing have, right? What are those features and specs? And here's the why. Well, why should I care as a customer? Notice here they rate all these products along things or along dimensions you might care about, like convenience of use, or how easy is it to clean, or what's the cooking performance look like, right? So they've translated all this stuff and put it into the quote value, if you will, that a customer might care about. All right, so that's a real important distinction. So when we look at these two things, value proposition, keep in mind value is in the eye of the beholder, right? That's the user's perspective. Proposition is what you're offering them. And I might offer the exact same thing to two different people, and one may say, yes, I'll buy it, and one may say no. So nothing's changed about my product. The only thing that's changed is the type of person and their underlying needs. So for one, I have a value proposition. For the other one, I do not. All right, so really figuring this out takes some time. Okay, so quick couple of points on value propositions before we move on. So one of the big sort of things that people overlook or oversights that I would say I see a lot from teams is the fact that when you come into this process, you'll often start by telling me about all the great benefits that you offer. All these things are said. It's so much faster, so much thinner, so much more accurate. And that may be really great. But remember, value is a two-sided sort of equation. You've got to subtract the cost from the benefit. So in addition to what you do well, are there any things you don't do so well? Are you going to ask people to trade things off? So apart from just how much you might charge for the thing, which is obviously a cost, the other question is, do you require some kind of performance costs or some other type of cost? Maybe you have a great solution for something, but it's not biodegradable or not recyclable. And that might be considered a social cost that people have to consider, even if they're not paying for it directly. So again, understanding that value is defined as benefit minus cost. You can't just forget the cost part of the equation. Fundamentally, you're trying to get at this. Are existing customers willing to fire whatever they're doing, change it, in order to hire yours, in order to hire your solution? And that's a pretty big ask, right? Because usually there's inertia. I've maybe already picked the solution, or I'm comfortable with it. So to get me to fire it, you're gonna have to be a whole lot better, or I must have a significant challenge, right? Some sort of unmet need with the existing solution. So I'll skip this, but I will just highlight one of the things I will tell teams. We sit down together and we work out, okay, well, what do you think the benefits will be for your solution? What do you think the costs might be? And then we do sort of that comparison so that they have a better understanding. And I will skip over these slides, which is just a build. You can take a look at that later. Now, the final question is, well, how much better? How much better do I need to be adopted, right? And I don't know until I go through this process of discovery. So again, stepping back and asking yourself crazy questions in this process can really help. And I love this one from Elon Musk. Would they use a solution even if it were free? And I love the quote from Musk because it highlights something he wouldn't use if it were free, and it's LiDAR. I don't know if you all know, but he's big advocate for using cameras and artificial intelligence to do obstacle detection for autonomous vehicles, whereas a lot of people are betting on LiDAR, but he doesn't think it's going to work. So the point here is, when you're doing discovery, you're just trying to make sure, hey, do we have something that's better enough that people would adopt it even if we gave it to them, right? Or are we totally off the mark here? And it can take some time to actually get there. Okay, so that's a quick, relatively quick, it certainly doesn't go into a great bit of depth, conversation around customers and value proposition for a moment. But as a reminder, high level, super high level, customers are people. People have jobs they need to get done, not their title, jobs they're trying to accomplish, things they're trying to accomplish. They have existing challenges or needs today as it relates to those. You're trying to figure out, do we have anything to address those existing needs? If we do, then we might have a value proposition. We might have enough here so that they fire what they're doing today and they hire our thing instead. And don't forget, you always have to think about not just benefit, but potential costs that you might incur, or a customer might incur if they switch to your thing. All right, so let's step back for a second. Let's talk about channels. Let's move beyond the customer. Let's assume you figured out a good customer to start with, and you think you've got a good value proposition, or maybe more than one, and you think people are really going to want it. Well, then there's these other things. You've validated a compelling reason or need to buy, but then there are these other things you need to figure out. Like, how am I going to get my stuff to these people? How do I even reach them, right? So selling to them, delivering the product or service to them, and then supporting them are important questions to ask. And that's really sort of this channels box. And to be honest, this is one of those areas that also is a startup killer. So the second time my company almost went out of business, and we had 3.5 of those, I'll call it 3.5, maybe it's more like 4, but I'll call it 3.5 near-death experiences. And this was number 2. We had the wrong channel. We were trying to sell through a channel that our customers didn't use. So understanding how your customer buys things today that kind of look like yours, really important. It's how do they want to be reached? not necessarily how you want to reach them. So one of the key things you're trying to understand is how do they want to find and buy new types of solutions. Now, the other thing I like to highlight is when we talk about channels, I distinguish between sales, how I sell to somebody, versus distribution, how I get my thing to somebody, versus how I support it. So we all are pretty familiar with online sales. We all buy things today online a lot of the time. But it usually gets delivered through a physical channel. Maybe it's FedEx or some other way it gets delivered to us. For a lot of the people that I work with, their technologies are fairly complicated and they may not sell them at all online. It may be an in-person sale. It may need to be shipped and then it may need to be supported. But understanding that the channel kind of has these three functions it has to serve: sales, distribution and logistics, and support. All right, so that's important to keep in mind. There are lots of ways to get to market. I won't bore you with this slide. I'll just say there are multiple steps for some people. Sometimes you sell directly to the customer. Other times you go through a retailer or some other group. And usually when you think about channels, the real question is, well, how many stops along the way are there between you and the customer who takes ownership of the product, right? But keep in mind, there are reasons that consumers go to some of these existing channels, and you need to make sure that you're in the right one. I'll skip this other than to say, the more complex your solution, usually the more complex the distribution and sales process. So for example, my product early on, the one we sold into construction was $30,000 to $50,000. The one we sold into aerospace was well over $500,000 and upwards. And they were both complex sales. So it meant that our distribution and our sales process was likewise complex. And then finally, and I'll just give one simple example, I won't go into this in great detail, but only to say that the channel you pick directly impacts your economics. As I like to say, those that sell get paid. So if you outsource some of the selling to somebody else, like a retailer, distributor, somebody else between you and the customer, those people take a cut. So understanding that you not only have to pick the channel that best suits your customer, you also need to consider what the economic consequences are of that choice is important to keep in mind, okay? Now, I won't go through these because I'm going to send these slides to Ala for you to kind of take a look at. But there are questions about channels that we'll have, teams that we work with ask when they're doing the interview process, but that's beyond what we're going to cover today. But things that you can ask can be stuff like, well, where do you buy products and services like this today? What do you like about your channel? What do you not like? There are all kinds of things you can explore because as a new company, you might choose to improve upon the channel that somebody's already using, possibly. All right, so another 10 minutes. We'll wrap up here fairly quickly. In addition to channels, how your thing gets to the customer, understanding how you get, keep, and grow customers is also really important. So how do you build awareness? How will they even know that you're out there? So I will highlight here that for most startups, the biggest challenge is this get piece, just building awareness that you're even an option, because you have to market, you got to promote yourself. You have to spend a lot of time and money trying to build this awareness. Now, in some cases, you might get lucky and you can build a lot of online awareness and you can build sort of a viral loop of awareness that kind of feeds on itself. But that isn't very common. It can happen, but it isn't very common. So you're going to have to think through this strategy. So when people think about the relationships, understanding how people become aware of offerings is super important, and it will help you determine what your cost of acquisition looks like. And I will not go into these questions either. I'll just say these are things you can take a look at if you have an interest. So that's kind of the relationship. So we have, again, customers, we have channels, the way for our products and services to get to them. We have relationships, ways for us to get, keep, and grow customers, selling more stuff. And then to finish out the right-hand side, we have the revenue, right? How are we actually going to make money, right? Important question, right? It's an important question. especially if you're building a startup. Some simple things to ask: who influences a purchase? What types of revenue models are they familiar with? Will they just buy an asset and then take ownership, or do they pay a subscription or a usage fee? There are lots of ways that you can generate revenue from a potential customer. And oh, by the way, the particular one you pick here is going to be very dependent on the customer you're serving and what they expect to see. All right. And then I won't go into this other than to say the revenue model is different than the pricing that you may pursue. And this is a little bit more detailed for when teams get to this point, but just understanding what a reasonable price to charge someone is a real tricky thing to do. And it takes some time to understand. Ultimately, we tell people you want to do what's called value-based pricing. In other words, you're trying to extract as much value out of the customer as you can while leaving them a little bit of value so that they'll pay you, right? But figuring this out can take a little bit of time. In fact, it usually takes quite a bit of time for most startups. But the basic point here is that the revenue model, how I'm going to generate revenue, is different than my pricing tactics, which is a separate conversation for usually later in the process. All right, so that's the right-hand side. I'll just spend a couple of minutes on the left-hand side here fairly quickly. There's obviously a lot of detail on any of these topics that we could go into and spend more time on. But as a high-level overview, I like to think of the left-hand side as kind of a balancing act. What do we need from others? Well, it's really, you start with what do you bring to the table, and then what do you need from others? All right. So I usually start here. What are our key activities and resources? What are we going to do? Right? What are our activities? And what are we bringing to the table? What are our key resources? So these are questions you kind of ask yourself, and then you have to do an analysis that says, well, where are we short? What else do we need? Now, often when I talk about activities, I'll say, I want to understand what your core competencies are. What are you really good at doing? Are you good at software design? Are you good at hardware design? What is it that you think your core team is really good at doing? And then walking through another series of activities, it tends to be more tactical. What do you need to do over the next 3 to 6 months to set yourself up for success? So there's the high level. This is the kind of company we're building. This is our core competency. And then sort of that detailed level of really getting nitty gritty about specific things you have to do over the next 3 to 6 months. So kind of 2 activity levels, if you will, and those things often change over time. When it comes to key resources, I mean, this is an example 4 that we typically talk about. Well, there's money. People, always want to talk about that. That's a resource they need. Instrumentation or equipment, people, and intellectual property. There are other types of resources, but these 4 categories capture most of what our teams are thinking about and most of the key resources they're going to ultimately need to build out their business. So as I mentioned, you can start with what you have, but also then you kind of finalize it by asking the question, well, what else do we need? Where are we short? Probably need some more money. Do we need more people? What else might we need? And then there's one final question you ask, which is, okay, how do we get access to this other stuff we need? Maybe we need partners. So like the term customer, partner is many uses to different types of people. But in our context, we like to say there are at least 4 different types of partners, and there could be more depending on how you do it. But they're development partners, people that help you build part of your solution, right? They're going to build a piece of it, you're going to build a piece of it, and together you'll have a whole product. That's a development partner. Sometimes they're just key suppliers. I need a really important component to put into my product. Right now, they may or may not be really a partner, but they might be a key supplier, somebody that you really need to have access to. And sometimes we kind of call these folks quasi-partners, but key suppliers are also important. Distribution, we talked about channels, but sometimes, again, you need a distribution partner. And then sometimes you just need access to stuff that you don't have access to without a partner. So they might be bringing other resources, not just money, but some other things. I've had teams working with people that need to get to libraries, drug libraries of data, right? And they had to partner with companies or organizations that had those libraries and had access to that data in order to build out their business models. So at the end of the day, you're trying to find a partnership that works for both. Remember, that's what partner implies. So thinking about partnerships, you have to understand partners, just like customers, need to have a reason to work with you. It's another way of saying they kind of have value propositions as well. And this is the final slide before I just stop my long monologue here and say, we always wrap up talking about various costs. I won't go into all of these here because for most people, this is a little bit more detailed than they bargained for. But for those teams and or those that are interested in really understanding what goes into sort of the cost equation, we work this through with you. But their categories of costs are often important to consider, particularly in the beginning, and whether or not you're going to have a lot of fixed costs or variable costs, all kinds of considerations there that do come up, but usually later in the process. So that is actually the quick, I would say relatively quick overview of what is involved in a business model. I'll go back to the one slide I started with here just to kind of show it one more time so that we land there. But keep in mind, when we think about business models, we're often referencing this one slide. We're using this one business model canvas to help us kind of guide ourselves as we go through the process. And the right side's mostly customer focused. Left side's mostly focused on how you build out the business. And your ultimate goal, of course, is to have a profitable business model. Revenue up, cost down. And if you're selling to other businesses, they too have a business model, and you'll want to understand this. All right, so that's my quick hour overview. I'm sorry, Ala, I probably didn't leave too much time for questions, but I will stay on as long as anybody would like to stay on.
Thank you so much, Edmund. Just knowing how you teach this, I know this was 1 hour is really not enough, but this I think was a very good overview. It's a lot of information, but really good information. So if anybody is interested in exploring this further and more in depth and also do practical applications, please apply to join August ICOR program. And I will send a link to everyone. I believe there's an info session coming up as well.
There is.
In the meantime, does anybody have any follow-up questions or any questions they would like to ask? So either submit them via the Q&A function with or without your name, or raise your hand. I think everybody's still digesting the information.
Right. They're like, well, we're still catching up with about halfway through what he was talking about. Yeah. And by the way, we will make sure these slides are available. And as Ala mentioned, this is a topic that we spread out over multiple days often. So don't worry if it feels like a lot. It's really mostly for you to hear these terms and phrases, to know that you've kind of gotten a sense for what's involved. And for most teams, the focus really is on who are the real customers, right? That's where we spend most of our time, in our course.
Yeah, and thank you, David. David is 3 steps ahead of me, so he just posted the link to August ICOR cohort dates. So feel free to take a look and feel free to register for that program if you're interested and serious about exploring this further. Let's see. So we have a question. I would like to know how to pinpoint the segment.
Yes, so that's an excellent question. And the reality is it's through that process of discovery, and I kind of referenced this, that we would take you through. So let's say you came into an ICOR course, or one of the courses we teach. We'd start with, well, who do you think you might help? And let's talk about a strategy about how to go do some discovery, which means talking to these folks to better understand, are you going after something that's really a challenge for them or not? Because here's an example. What often happens is, well, you have a group of people, like I mentioned, my startup was going after surveyors. And it takes a little while for you to figure out, oh, all surveyors are not the same. In fact, there are 4 different types, right? And oh, should I go after surveyors or should I go after aerospace? So I kind of decided after a little bit of time in my startup, well, we should focus on construction, on surveyors. But even then, didn't realize that there were 4 subgroups. So we would help you through that process. And that's how you kind of refine it down and find the right sort of segment or subsegment to go after. So it's through using customer discovery that you can do that. It's impossible to guess it without doing discovery as part of that exercise.
And even if you think you know the market, like Edmund was talking about, before he went after that survey market, he actually worked as one and thought he really knew the market well, right?
Exactly.
We didn't go into those details, but.
Yeah, and then I see the question about interviews, and this is a whole separate topic, and we will cover all of this in our ECHO class, but the challenges of getting people for interviews. I think really that is the big challenge, is just finding people, quote, to talk to. But it's a lot of hard work, but once you start to identify people and have a little success getting through to them, then we find it's a lot easier because you can ask them for references and other people that you might speak to. And we talk about how strategically to reach out to people, how to use LinkedIn, how to use other types of tools to find people in the course. So we give most of our guidance, I would say, is very much focused on that very, very topic, because it's one thing to say go talk to people, but it's not always easy to find them.
Yeah. And do you have time for one more question, Edmund?
Of course, I do. I absolutely do.
Great, thank you. So if you find two customers that are not great, will you still pursue both of them or just one?
Not both of them not great. Is that what you said, Ala, in the question?
Yeah, that's the question. Ragnish, if you would like to
let me give you,
clarify.
Yeah, no. Let me give you a couple of examples, because I think I know what people are asking there. So.
Oh, he just clarified. He says they are great. If both of the customers are great, would you?
Both of them are great.
Okay, thank you. That makes more sense.
Yeah. So the first question you would ask yourself is, are these customers the same type or not? Or are they significantly different? So let me use my example because it's easy for me to talk about it. Construction and aerospace. And let's say I found a construction customer that was going to be great, and I found an aerospace customer that was going to be great. And this is kind of what happened to us. The problem was I tried to go after both at the same time. That was probably a mistake. What I should have done is talk to a lot of construction people to know if I had a better fit there, or a lot of aerospace companies to know if I had a better fit there. So sometimes you have to pick and choose. And the answer to your question somewhat depends, because you might find, this is not common, but you might find that the customers, even though they're very different, have a similar set of needs. And you could go after either one. Now the question is, okay, how accessible are they? Is one easier to get to? Is one more well-funded and able to pay, right? There could be other considerations which would lead you to pick one over the other, even if the needs look about the same. Hopefully that makes sense, but you wouldn't know that until you talk to them, right? And try to figure that out. So that takes a little time. So even if your product can meet the needs of both customers relatively the same in an equal way, understanding other aspects of the business model will be really critical to picking the best place.
Right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Edmund. Thank you to those who attended and stayed until the very end. As a reminder, we recorded this presentation and we'll post it on YouTube on our Startup UMD video. And I will follow up, and we can we share your slides as well?
Yes, indeed, I'll send them to you.
Slides as well. All right. Thank you very much, Edmund. This is fantastic as always.
Thanks, Ala. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.